Hello everyone, this is Professor Reimer. This video is for my world history class on Wednesday, May 26th and Thursday, May 27th. It's entitled Unit 10, DOL 3, The Cold War in the 1960s and 1970s. Our objective is the same as last time. We will explain the impact of major events associated with the Cold War by creating an annotated map. We did an annotated map last time. We're going to add to it, or if you would like, make a new one, this time focusing on major events in the 1960s and in the 1970s. As always, we'll begin with a preview. Study this map to identify the location of Cuba as it relates to the location of the United States. What is the location, and why might the United States object to Cuba having nuclear missiles? Pause the video, write down your responses, come back and hear my thoughts. All right. If you said it's really, really close, you would be correct. I think it's about 90 miles from coast to coast. So why might the U.S. object? Well, the Cubans might fire the nuclear missiles at the United States. And it got very close to that in October of 1962. We're going to get into that today. But first, a bit of review. We've been talking now 3 days about the Cold War. Remember, it's this ideological struggle between the United States and the USSR for world domination. The USSR, led by Joseph Stalin, you see there, from 1927 to 1953. And remember, the Cold War begins partly because Stalin spread communism into the satellites in Eastern Europe. Remember, satellites are these friendly nations nearby. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all adopted communist-style governments. He also blockaded Berlin in 1948 as a way to end the West's control of West Berlin. It didn't work. He also, under him, the USSR tested the atomic bomb in 1949 and the hydrogen bomb in 1953. Right? These tests helped increase tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we also talked last time about the communist takeover of China, which finalized in 1949. That sounds right. Yeah, 49. He signed a treaty of friendship in 1950 with Mao Zedong. Stalin and Mao signed this treaty of friendship. So now you have the two largest communist nations in the world as allies. Remember also last time we talked about the Korean War. Stalin sent weapons to communists in North Korea. The U.S. supported South Korea. Remember, the U.S. led a UN, it was UN, not NATO, led a UN force to push the North Koreans back across the border. And that war still has not ended. It has simply been a ceasefire for the last 60 years or so. In 1953, however, his death changed the Soviet Union and how it approached the Cold War against the United States. In fact, fun fact, no one knew Stalin was dead for many hours because no one wanted to go in and be the first one to discover that the leader was dead for fear that they might be accused of being the one who brought about his death. As far as I know, he died of natural causes. I think, yes. All right, new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, you see him there on the left, begins a series of reforms known as de-Stalinization. In other words, the ending of some of Stalin's more harsh, that's not even the right word, awful policies, throwing people in jail on just trumped up charges, executions of people, the use of famine as a political weapon. There's just this culture of fear and leader worship in the Soviet Union under Stalin's time that begins to relax under Khrushchev, and he seemed willing to work with the U.S. to ease Cold War tensions. You see him here with the U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. However, the tensions did escalate throughout the 50s and the 60s for reasons let's get into. By the way, I forgot to point this out, there is a note-taking guide to be using as you follow along. Use it. It will help you gather information. to be used on our annotated map. All right, we mentioned this last time, but as a review, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, and the space race began. The US and the Soviet Union raced to put men in space, raced to put men on the moon. Also, remember we talked about last time, the arms race is nuclear arms race, especially after the creation of ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles. In other words, missiles that could cross continents carrying nuclear weapons, right? It leads to this massive buildup of nuclear weapons. All right, in 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes president. He's seen as a Cold War hawk, right? He's seen as aggressive in his fight against the Soviet Union. And he and Khrushchev faced two important crises that really heightened Cold War tensions: the building of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let's get into those, right? So in 1961, in Berlin, remember Berlin is a divided city in the eastern part of Germany, in what was known as East Germany, right? He's upset with the increasing number of communist East Germans who moved to democratic West Berlin. And to stop this, he encourages the government in East Berlin to build a wall, right? Very similar, right, to this blockade of Stalin's in 1948. President Kennedy, on the other hand, promised to protect West Berlin. So, you know, they're facing off in this standoff. So instead of blockading, communist leaders built a wall to keep East Germans out of West Berlin. So you see here Berlin, remember it's in East Germany. The red, this is East Berlin. In yellow, this is West Berlin. And almost overnight, the communist leaders in East Berlin built a wall around West Berlin. How were they able to do that? Remember, all of Berlin was in communist-controlled East Germany. So now let's take a look at the wall. Look, I mean, it went up so quickly, almost overnight. You see here the workers, right, separating East Berlin from West Berlin. And you see here the wall finished, and it divided families. It divided the city, and it was seen as the iconic image of the Cold War. This worldwide struggle between the two powers, this tension between the two powers. It had two walls, right? It had this taller wall surrounding West Berlin, about 110 miles, and then it had this death strip, sort of like a moat around the castle, where there would be patrols. You see here floodlights, electric fences, and then vehicle traps, and then there's this outer wall. Many people, let me go back. Many people died trying to sneak across the wall. Many people were imprisoned after they tried to sneak in through some of the gates, because there were a few gates. The Brandenburg Gate being the most famous. I've actually seen a piece of the Berlin Wall. It was about 10 feet tall, made of concrete. I saw it at a museum in DC one time, and on one side, totally clean, just bare concrete, and on the other side, graffiti all over. Which one do you think was the west side, and which one was the east side? The graffiti was on the west side. They hated the wall. They hated how it divided their city, so they graffitied it all over. People in the east feared any kind of retribution from the government, and so they stayed away and didn't damage the wall. All right, now let's turn to a much closer piece of territory to the United States, and that is Cuba. You see Fidel Castro there. In 1959, successfully seizes power. He's claiming to be a communist, but in reality, he probably used more of the tactics to seize power. How committed of a communist he was, historians debate. But the U.S., I mean, at the time when he seized power, he claimed to be communist, and so the U.S. feared the spread of communism so close to America. Now, the U.S., when Kennedy got elected, won the election, he inherited this plan from the CIA to secretly arm Cuban refugees to send them back to Cuba to lead a rebellion to overthrow Castro. CIA presents it to Kennedy, says, hey, we got this worked out. Can we do it? He says yes, and it turns out to be a disaster. Logistically, strategically, it doesn't work. The refugees are either killed or captured. Kennedy looks like a bumbling idiot. But from the Soviet side, they see it as a danger to a communist friend. Plus, the U.S. is putting nuclear missiles in the Soviet Union's backyard in Turkey. And so Khrushchev secretly sends nuclear missiles to Cuba. All right, so in October of 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane takes photographs of these nuclear weapons. And so for the next 13 days, there's a standoff, right, between the Soviet Union and the United States. There were many in the United States who wanted to first strike, right? We must launch against the Soviet Union before they launch against us. Kennedy ultimately doesn't go that route. He goes with a quarantine. Now, it's really a blockade, but had he called it a blockade, that would have been seen as an act of war, because blockading a country is seen as an act of war. So he doesn't call it a blockade, he calls it a quarantine. And in the meantime, as U.S. warships are standing there ready to attack any Soviet boat heading to Cuba, Kennedy's brother is negotiating with the Soviet Union to resolve the conflict and ultimately reach a deal that Khrushchev will remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. removing the missiles in Turkey. However, the U.S. said it had to be done secretly, like many months later, not a part of the deal. And the Americans promised to never invade Cuba again. And they have stuck to that promise. And it really was. It was the closest the U.S. and USSR ever came to, with some declassified information. We now know it was very, very close. All right, let's now turn to the other major event, at least from U.S. and Vietnamese perspective, in the 1960s, and that is the U.S. involvement in what in the U.S. is called the Vietnam War, where in Vietnam it's known as the War for Independence. So, communist leader Ho Chi Minh, you see here, helped Vietnam gain independence from France. Vietnam had been part of French Indochina, a colony in the late 19th and much of the 20th century. Right, the French refused to give up their colony after World War II, and they fought the forces of Ho Chi Minh, who were seeking to rid them. And they won a very key battle in 1954, and Vietnam was divided. I'll get to that in just a minute, but remember, this is an era of the Cold War. The U.S., remember, under the policy of containment, had pledged to stop the spread of communism anywhere it seemed to be spreading. So here's, like I said, divided at this 17th parallel into communist North Vietnam. This is in 1954. It might have been a few years after at the Paris Peace Conference. I can't remember. And in South Vietnam, it's a quote-unquote democratic government, very dictatorial. And communists there, known as the Viet Cong, were fighting a guerrilla war to overthrow that government and to unify North and South Vietnam. So beginning in the late 50s, the U.S. were sending military advisors, members of the CIA, to advise the South Vietnamese. In 1965, the U.S. escalates the war and begins sending combat troops. Look how many. By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. service members in Vietnam, South Vietnam, fighting this Viet Cong, these communist rebels seeking to unify North and South Vietnam. All right, and how'd they do it? Large-scale bombing raids, mostly, and also search and destroy missions, right? Boots on the ground, seeking out the Viet Cong. They also use pesticides to destroy a lot of the vegetation that the Viet Cong were using to camouflage their movements. You see here American bombers. Here's that pesticide. It was awful. Caused cancer to people. They napalmed, which dropped this chemical called napalm that burned whole villages. Over 60,000 Americans lost their lives, and I think more than 2 million Vietnamese lost their lives in the conflict. And despite all these efforts, the U.S. was unable to defeat the communist enemy. It was on their ground, and they were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, and the U.S. simply weren't. It was expensive. It really hurt the U.S. economy. All the spending on the military meant that the government was not able to spend money on other consumer goods, and it became really, really unpopular back home in the United States. Finally, in 1973, the U.S. withdrew, and 2 years later, communists unified Vietnam, and Vietnam remains to this day a communist country. But a communist country now, the U.S. has diplomatic dealings with. All right, let's pause. Whew, take a breath, go back, check your notes, and then answer this question. Why did the United States get involved in wars in Korea and Vietnam? Did you say C? Yeah, containment, containment, containment. That was the U.S. policy during the Cold War. Stop communism from spreading. That is what the containment policy meant. All right. So America's failure in Vietnam led to a change in Cold War policies. It abandons its containment policy. It didn't work. And that whole domino theory of, China becomes communist, Vietnam becomes communist, all the rest of Southeast Asia is going to become communist. It didn't happen. And so the U.S. began looking for ways to improve relations with the Cold War enemies. Also, China and the Soviet Union had a falling out. And so Nixon sees an opportunity to ease tensions and improve relations, especially with China. It's under this policy of détente, or in French, right, softening, I think. That becomes the new policy instead of brinkmanship. Remember, brinkmanship is like going right to the edge. We will drop a nuke if we have to, right? Nixon, far more realpolitik. What that means, he focused more on using actual power to help the U.S. improve, kind of like a chess player. In fact, Nixon was an incredible chess player. So he often thought very strategically about where and how to use U.S. Foreign policy. He becomes the first president to visit China. There you see him, and recognize communist China. Remember, up until this point, the U.S. Recognized the government in Taiwan as the legitimate government in China. There you see President Nixon and his wife on the Great Wall of China. And so he's improving relations with the Chinese, puts pressure on the Soviet Union to negotiate with the U.S., which they do to discuss arms reduction and eventually to sign a strategic arms limitation treaty, or SALT, which limited the number of ICBMs each nation could have, right? You can't go above a certain amount, and you will allow inspectors to come in and verify that, in fact, you are following your promises that you put in the treaty. So in the 70s, they seemed willing to peacefully coexist. And then in 1979, things changed when the USSR, Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan to put down an anti-communist uprising. Afghanistan is a landlocked country here in Central Asia that borders the Soviet Union, but also countries of Iran. Right? The U.S. again seized the attack as an attempt to once again spread communism into South Asia and the Middle East, and it returns to its more traditional, or at least previous, policy of containment. and funding resistance fighters. What the U.S. did is that it sent military and economic aid to Afghan rebels, especially anti-aircraft weapons and anti-helicopter weapons. Eventually, I think $1 billion the U.S. give towards groups like the Taliban. And here's one of these awful twists of history: is that the Taliban were one of these mujahideen, these rebels fighting the Soviet occupation. Once they successfully win the war, the U.S. withdraws all support. And so Afghanistan is left war-torn, very young population with very little economic opportunities. And this group seized power and established a very strict Islamic government, very repressive, especially on women, and most importantly to the United States history, it gave sanctuary to international Islamic terrorists, such as Osama bin Laden, who used Afghanistan as a training site for the 2001 to 9/11 attacks against the United States. Had the U.S. continued its aid to Afghanistan, it's likely that such extreme groups like the Taliban would not have risen to power. They seized power with American weapons, yeah. All right, a little side note there. All right, here we go. Back to our PowerPoint. Nearing the end. For the Soviet Union, it really exhausted their economy and proved as unwinnable as Vietnam was for the United States. And it renewed tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. Also renewing tensions is a new U.S. president. You see there, Ronald Reagan. He was a strong anti-communist, very, very strong, who dramatically increased the defense spending in the United States, and spoke very harsh words about the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire, which many people attribute to helping bring it into the Cold War in 1991. I subscribe to a different view. I see it more as internal ineffectiveness of Soviet command economy policies. It just doesn't work for one group, the government, to be able to send supplies like food and medicine wherever they need to go, like this central economy, which is the system that the U.S. or the USSR had. It was eventually crushed by its own weaknesses and inefficiencies. All right, here we are to the processing activity. Like I said, it's again an annotated map. You must have the name of the event, indicate the location of the event, like draw a line, and give a summary of its impact. Most important here, summary, short, 1 to 3 sentences, its impact, right? The effect of the event, especially as it relates to the Cold War, and as last time, label the two superpowers. All right, here they are: building the Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, the USA war in Vietnam, and the USSR war in Afghanistan. All right, make sure these 4 are on the map. Let me know if you have any questions in our Google meeting, and I will see you then. Bye, guys.